This week we're going to be looking quite a bit more at the emergence of modern nationalism, and we'll be using some case studies to do so. Perhaps one of the most clear and most prominent studies of modern nationalism could be completed by focusing on the case of the PNI, the Partai Nasional Indonesia, in Indonesia, which becomes a very substantial state, although the largest populated Muslim state in the world, also a secular republic, a democratic republic with a republican system of government that has democratic representation, at least theoretically, gradually emerging, although we'll see some contestations with that narrative as well. Just to give you a sense of the population here, the population of Indonesia is roughly the same size as the United States, although geographically much more dispersed. In the case of modern nationalism in Indonesia, you have an emergent nationalist group that is anti-colonial, the PNI, which is roughly comparable to the INC in India, which you have already seen, or the case of the Kuomintang, or the KMT in the Republic of China, which is another important comparable case. The KMT being headed by Sun Yat-sen at first, and then gradually becoming a right-wing nationalist movement. Also in Indonesia, along with the PNI, you have the Partai Komunis Indonesia, or the PKI, the communists who led a revolt in 1926, and then also continued that revolt until 1927, although it was brutally repressed by Dutch. The PNI, the nationalists, then sought to capitalize off of this energy. Indonesia Muda was Sukarno's publication of the nationalist cause, and you might essentially think of this publication, Indonesia Muda, as one of the key publications of the PNI movement. Note that the PNI didn't have the popular appeal that the INC had in India or the Indo-Chinese Communist Party, Ho Chi Minh's Communist Party, which you're now familiar with from the case of French Indochina. Sukarno was also arrested by the Dutch in 1931. However, he was released to the Japanese in 1942, and then upon the retreat of the Japanese from Southeast Asia in 1945, he declared independence, just as Japan retreated with its military, essentially passing off arms to the Dutch, or to the Indonesian nationalists. The direct role of Hatta and other elements of the Japanese Empire was felt in Indonesia, and the impact of the Japanese Empire on Indonesian society has been widely documented in that area, including having an impact on the sectors of the development of Indonesian film, propaganda films for the nationalists, and so forth, as well as in the cultural sphere more broadly. Recent master's thesis from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, for example, which was presented at the Annual Association of Asian Studies Conference in Washington, D.C. a couple of years ago, was able to argue convincingly that Japanese Empire had a lasting impact on the trajectory of the Indonesian film industry. And another portion of new research paper will put forward the argument, research paper in process, that Japanese Empire was the catalyst to a new Hindu movement on the island of Borneo. That's from some of my research, which also has survived up through the present. So there's these cultural impacts to Japanese Empire, including on the nationalist movement. Indeed, the impact of Japanese Empire on the islands of Indonesia could not be underestimated, introducing a hint of irony to Sukarno's anti-imperial stance. But the PKI, like many other communist organizations in the world, simply grew every time it was put down, it would seem, broadly speaking, throughout the 20th century. Pro-colonial militarism, after all, never proved to be an effective way of suppressing militant guerrilla revolutionaries over the course of the middle of the 20th century. Dutch attacks on the PKI simply created martyrs, and then martyrs created more cadres. But in 1965, there were roughly around 3.5 million militant cadre and 20 million general members of the PKI's organization. You could compare this to the pittance of members that the Communist Party gets as membership in the United States, something like 50,000 at its peak, compared to millions in Indonesia. Sukarno became therefore increasingly interested in making political negotiations with the PKI so that he could maintain power. And what happened? Well, eventually a US-backed coup would oust him, and recent declassified documents further linked to the CIA not only the coup but also subsequent military disputes, as well as the purge of some so-called communist forces across the archipelago, resulting in the genocide of 2 million Indonesians. These killings took on an ethnic dimension on the islands of Bali, Java, and Sumatra, where Peranakan Chinese or Indo-Chinese, Indonesian Chinese, as well as Acehnese were disproportionately targeted. The US-backed genocide, in short, by raw numbers, is comparable to the Cultural Revolution or the Cambodian genocide, two other cases that we'll mention in this course. The Cultural Revolution I'm also covering in a very detailed fashion in my China and the World course, so hopefully some of you will be able to take that course in the future. Additionally, we will pick up on this thread later in the semester, but for the time being, let us return to Bandung, a conference where Sukarno steps out onto the world stage. In the 1940s in Southeast Asia, colonial powers were the Japanese, the British, the Dutch, the French, so forth, also the Americans and the Philippines, although independence in Indonesia came in 1945, and this was also the case in Vietnam, and the Philippines followed in 1946. Burma, Sri Lanka, Korea, and Malaysia would eventually come in 1948. Then you see the independence, new sort of republic in China established in 1949, and then independence of Ghana beginning in 1951, formulated and then formalized in 1957, independence in Libya in 1951, and in Sudan from the British in 1956. So broadly speaking, from the 1940s through the 1950s, we are speaking of a process of independence and new national movements succeeding in both Africa and Asia. To keep the British at bay, 500,000 residents in Bandung in the 1940s set fire to warehouses, homes, and government offices. This is on the island of Java in Indonesia. They sang a song which, if we could translate the lyrics, said, hello, hello, Bandung, the capital of Parahangan, the city of remembrance. For a long time I have not met you. Now you are the sea of fire. Let's take over again. Boom. Or boom means like sibling, but it also could be translated to comrade in this case. This song was sung by Primordia youth activists. There was also a 1955 rebellion in the context here that was led by Darul Salam in Indonesia. It's an anti-colonial force that aimed to establish an Islamic republic. The Indonesian government selected Bandung as the site of the so-named Conference of 29 Afro-Asian nations because of this history. The project of Sukarno, the political project of Sukarno, is not just the nation of Indonesia, but it is also a sort of Bandung project. Post-colonial in that the participants were united by their experience of colonialism. Anti-racist in that the participants viewed racism as a phenomenon that put European, Japanese, and American imperialism supposedly and rhetorically on the top, and them in subordinate positions. Therefore, they sought to upend this order and create a more equal world. Sukarno, who's pictured here as a student in 1916, emerges as a figure in the international stage from the Bandung movement. Now the historian, Vijay Prashad, asks back into the past, what is left for this third world on a planet where the atom bomb and the dollar determined the course of human history, what is left for a region that contained 2,000 million people? These questions almost seem to prompt Sukarno to respond from the past with a quote that crystallizes his project. We can inject the voice of reason into world affairs. We can mobilize all the spiritual, all the moral, all the political strength of Asia and Africa on the side of peace. Sukarno himself, as a figure, is, to put it in terms of the day, a revolutionary bourgeoisie. He was a lesser royal, educated, professional, and anti-imperial. He's very similar to Jawaharlal Nehru, like in this sense, or UNU in Myanmar and Burma, or Ho Chi Minh in French Indochina and then what became Vietnam, and many others internationally in this regard.